The bishop's wife came to my kitchen on a Tuesday. She did not sit down. She stood by my door with her hands folded under her apron, and she looked at the floor instead of at me, and she said, "Anna, the ministers have spoken. You will not do this again. It is not our way." And then she left. She did not ask how I was. She did not ask about the child I had buried 9 days before. She only came to tell me that what I had done with my grief was forbidden, and that if I did it again there would be consequences I already understood. I was 52 years old. I had buried 3 children in my life by then, and I had followed every rule for the first 2. But the third one broke something loose in me, and what I did after she was born still, on a cold March morning, is the reason my own daughters were told not to write to me. Before I go any further, my name is Anna. I grew up Old Order Amish in Geauga County, Ohio, and I lived that life for more than 50 years before I left it. This is Hannah, the Amish girl, the channel where I say the things we were never permitted to say out loud, the things that were buried as deep as the babies were. If you want to hear the truth about Amish life from a woman who lived nearly her whole life inside it, subscribe and tap the like button, and tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? I read every single one. Let me explain something that outsiders find hard to believe. In my world, a stillbirth was not spoken of. There was no funeral, the way you would imagine a funeral. When a baby came into the world without breath, she was washed, she was wrapped, and she was buried quickly, often within a day, in the corner of the graveyard where the smallest graves are. Many of those graves had no stone at all. Some had a stone the size of my hand, with no name on it, only a number or nothing. You must understand the theology underneath this, because the theology is everything. In my community, there was a belief that too much grief was a kind of pride. Gelassenheit, we called it. Yielding. Submission to God's will. If God took a child, then a faithful woman bowed her head and said it was His will, and she did not question, and she did not weep too long, and she did not, above all, make a display of her sorrow. To grieve loudly was to say that you knew better than God what should have been. And there was no greater sin in our world than believing you knew better than God. So a woman who lost a baby was expected to be back at her stove within days, back at the wash, back in her pew on Sunday with her face still and her hands quiet. The other women would not speak of it to her. They would bring food, yes. They would leave it on the porch. But no one would say the child's name, because the child, in the eyes of the Ordnung, the unwritten rules that governed every hour of our lives, had never truly been a person in the world. She had not been baptized. She had not drawn breath. And so she was to be released without ceremony and without lingering. My first 2 I released the way I was taught. I buried them, and I said nothing, and I was back at my work. I told myself the numbness was faith. For 30 years I told myself that. But I want to tell you what actually happened the night before my Sarah was buried, because that is where everything changed. She came in March, in the cold, and she came still. The midwife, an Amish woman named Fanny, who had brought half the county into the world, wrapped her and handed her to me for a few minutes only, because that was allowed, and then she reached to take her back, and I would not give her. I held that child, and I looked at her small face, and I saw that she had my mother's chin, and something in me that had been obedient for 52 years simply would not let go. Fanny was gentle, but she was firm. "Anna," she said, "it is time. It is not good to hold too long." and she was not being cruel. She was protecting me from myself, from the danger of loving too visibly. But I held on, and that night, after they had finally taken her to be washed and wrapped, I did the first forbidden thing. I took a candle to the kitchen table, and I found a scrap of paper, and I wrote her name, Sarah. I wrote the date. I wrote how much she weighed, because Fanny had told me, and I wrote one sentence. She had her grandmother's chin, and I saw it. That paper does not sound like a scandal to you, but you have to understand, we did not keep such things. We did not photograph our dead. We did not mark the graves of the unbaptized. To write it down, to make a record, to insist that this child had existed and had a face and a chin and a name that was already stepping outside of what was permitted. Because a record is a refusal to forget, and I was supposed to forget. But that was only the beginning. What happened over the next 11 Sundays, I cannot carry it in 20 minutes. There are things this recording cannot hold. The names, the counting, the drawer, the dress I kept for 27 years. 3 years ago, I wrote it all down. The book is called The Sundays. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. Let me tell you about the drawer, because that is what they truly could not forgive. After Sarah, I began to do something no one knew about at first. I took the small dress I had sewn for her while I carried her, the one she never wore, and I did not give it away, and I did not bury it with her the way I was supposed to. I folded it, and I put it in the bottom drawer of my dresser under the winter quilts where no one looked. And beside it, I put the paper with her name. And then, God forgive me, I began to add the others. I wrote down the first 2, my babies from all those years before, the ones I had released without a word. I wrote their names, the names I had never once spoken aloud, because we had not even named them properly. They had gone into the ground as numbers, but I had named them in my heart the whole time and never told a soul. So I wrote them down too, 3 names in a drawer, under the quilts, in a house where such a thing was not done. And then I did the thing that got me shunned. There was a young woman in our district, 22 years old, married 2 years, and she lost her first the same spring I lost my Sarah. And I watched them do to her exactly what had been done to me, the food on the porch, the silence, the expectation that she'd be at the wash within the week. And I watched her walk through it with that same numb, obedient face I had worn for 30 years. And I could not do it. I could not stand at the fence and say nothing. So I went to her, and I sat in her kitchen, and I said the words no one had ever said to me. I said, "Did she have a face? Tell me what she looked like. Did you name her? You are allowed to have named her in here, where no one can hear." And that young woman broke open like a dam. She had named her Rebecca. She had never said it out loud to anyone. And we sat at her table, and we said the name Rebecca back and forth to each other until she could breathe again. That is what I was forbidden to do. Not the writing, not even the drawer, though they came to hate the drawer. What I was truly forbidden to do was to grieve out loud, and worse, to teach another woman that she was allowed to grieve out loud, because grief that is spoken spreads, and a community built on silence cannot survive women who have learned to speak. Word travels in an Amish district faster than any telephone. Within a month, it was known that Anna was sitting with the grieving women, that Anna was asking them the names, that Anna kept something in a drawer. And that is when the bishop's wife came to my kitchen on that Tuesday and told me the ministers had spoken. I did not stop. I want to be honest with you. I could have stopped, and my life would have stayed whole, and my daughters would still write to me. But I had spent 30 years being numb and calling it faith, and I had just learned in my 50s that I had a voice, and I could not put it back in the box. When the next woman lost a child, I went to her too. I sat in her kitchen. I asked her the names. And so they did what my community does when a member will not yield. They began the Meidung, the shunning. It does not happen all at once. First, it is the small things. Someone does not answer when you speak at a gathering. Your sister looks past you at church as though you are made of glass. Then it grows. You are not invited to help with the canning. Your grown children are told, gently, by the ministers, that to remain close to you is to share in your disobedience. The hardest was my own daughters. I have 3 living daughters, and they did not choose this. You must understand, they did not turn from me out of cruelty. They turned from me because they had their own children and their own place in the church, and to keep me was to lose everything they had. So the letters stopped. The visits stopped. My youngest, Mary, held out the longest. She wrote to me in secret for almost a year, letters she hid from her husband. And then one day even those stopped, and I understood, and I did not blame her, and it was the worst grief of my life, worse than the babies, because the babies were taken by God, and my daughters were taken by the rules. Let me tell you what I found on the outside, because it is the reason I can speak at all. When I left, at 58 years old, an old woman with a drawer full of paper, I eventually sat across from an English doctor, a woman with kind eyes, and I told her the whole of it. The 3 babies, the silence, the years of calling numbness faith. And she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I have carried every day since. She said, "Anna, what they told you was grief was actually mourning that was never allowed to finish. Grief that cannot speak does not heal. It only waits. Grief that cannot speak does not heal. It only waits." I had waited 30 years, and I will tell you the thing I understand now that I could not understand then. The silence was never really about God. I have read my Bible my whole life, and there is no verse in it that tells a mother she may not weep for her child. Even the Lord himself wept at a grave, and he knew he was about to raise the man. No. The silence was about control. My therapist told me this, and it took me a year to accept it. She said, "Control does not always look like a rule that forbids you to leave. Sometimes control looks like a community that forbids you to grieve, because a woman who has learned to feel her own sorrow will eventually learn to feel her own life. I do not tell you this to make you hate the Amish. I need you to hear that. The Amish world gave me things I will carry to my own grave. A community that showed up for every barn raising and every funeral that was permitted. Hands that fed you when you were sick without being asked. A faith that underneath all the rules was real to me and in some quiet way still is. I am not bitter at the people. Many of them are grieving in that same silence right now and do not even know it. But there is no theology that requires a mother to bury her child without a name. There is no scripture that makes her sorrow a sin. There is no God I believe in now who gave a woman a heart that breaks and then commanded her to pretend it had not. I still have the drawer. It came with me when I left. The dress is in it and the papers with all the names. I am an old woman now, and I keep it by my bed. And sometimes at night I take out the paper that says Sarah, and I read the one sentence, "She had her grandmother's chin, and I saw it." And I say her name out loud in a room where no one will ever tell me I am not allowed. That is the whole of what I did that they could not forgive. I refuse to forget my own children. I refuse to let another woman believe she had to. If you grew up in a place where your sorrow was called pride, I see you. If you were ever told that a faithful heart is a silent one, that healing looks like going back to the stove and saying nothing, I am telling you tonight that they were wrong. Your grief was never a sin. Your child had a face. You are allowed to say the name. If this reached something in you, tell me in the comments. Tell me the name if you have one you were never allowed to say. This is a safe place to say it. And if you want the rest, the parts 20 minutes cannot hold. The book is called The Sundays. The link is in the description and the pinned comment. The Sundays, what 20 minutes cannot hold. Link in the description and the pinned comment. The morning is yours, if you decide it is.